This happened when I was 12 years old at an all-boys sleepaway camp in 2010. It was nicknamed Camp Boone in the Carolinas and was a one-week camp for kids who were mainly into the outdoors. It's a really nice camp in the middle of the woods with lots of streams, hiking trails, and even a big lake. It wasn't exactly Boy Scouts or anything, but just the sheer desire for kids my age to have a good summer. We do have to watch out for bears, black panthers, and even black widows, which were all native to North Carolina. The first day we had gotten there, our camp counselor had told us to unpack our belongings and to put them in our assigned cabins. We'd be staying in these small cabins appropriate for about 4 campers. The first few days went pretty well for the most part, with us doing several activities around the camp. These activities usually ranged anywhere from archery to whitewater rafting. However, it was that Thursday night where things took an unexpected turn. It was around 6 p.m. and our group had just finished eating at the dining hall in the lodge. After we had eaten, our camp counselors had gathered our group to go roast marshmallows by the fire pit. Now, the way that this fire pit is set up is that it's located a little ways away from the camp in the woods. Basically, you had to go through this trail that led into a large clearing, and in the center of that was the fire pit. In other words, it was surrounded by a bunch of trees which could easily catch on fire. We all sat down on the provided chairs around the campfire where we had begun sharing stories and making s'mores. Anyway, it's around 9 p.m. at night, and one of the counselors was telling us a story about his scary experience working the night shift. As he's about halfway through the story, our whole group suddenly hears what sounded like a large branch snap from somewhere in the woods. Everyone immediately goes quiet, as if a switch were turned off. Keep in mind that we were quite a ways away from the campsite, which meant that we were in bear territory, which we thought what made the sound. The counselors look at each other with these concerned faces and proceed to take out their bear spray. Almost instantly, we were told to pack up and get back on the trail immediately. We pack up our things, put out the fire, and shined our flashlights to light the way. We find the trail, and as we were getting back on it, we hear clear as day a blood-curdling scream behind us. Almost instantly, everyone comes to a complete stop, and we shine our flashlights by a few trees where we heard it. I'm not sure what it was, but something about the scream really unsettled me. It almost didn't sound human. One of our senior counselors tells us to run and to not look back while he radioed security of the camp. As we were running, the scream was heard again, this time a lot louder, indicating that whatever this was following us. We run for a good few minutes with some of the younger campers nearly crying before we got back to camp. Waiting for us at the lodge was a pair of rangers who had questioned our counselors while we stayed indoors. Rangers and the SOC had went to the area where we had heard the screams but were unable to find anything. This meant that whoever or whatever it was never followed us out of those woods. For those of you who don't know what the SOC is, it's basically the police of the woods, which stands for the Summit Operations Center. They basically get dispatched for situations if someone goes missing, a threat to the camp, or any natural hazards. I remember us having to cut the trip early that night, with a bus coming to pick us up in the morning. Our parents were obviously informed about what had happened, with some even pulling their children out of the camp program. It was a sad turnout, but at the end of the day, I could understand why they chose to. I stuck around with that summer camp for a couple more years before finally leaving once I got into my high school years. What was once a nice summer camp full of awesome activities, only to be turned into something much more upsetting. Up until now, that day still brings back those memories of what happened. I have a few theories as to what actually happened that night, but they're too complicated to explain. This just goes to show you that nothing good happens in the woods. When I was around 9, I attended a summer camp at a Christian community center that my parents had signed me up for. It was a school for the most part, but they had a summer camp program right by our house, which is why I went. It was a nice camp, and I made a few friends within the first week or so. One of my friends, who I'll call David, connected with me very well and got to know each other for a good portion of the summer. He was just one of those people who you could always relate to and gave off that sort of energizing vibe. One night, the camp was hosting this sort of annual sleepover for all respective campers. All parents had to give their permission for their child to stay the night, with all food and utilities provided by the camp. Both my parents had agreed to it, even though I didn't feel like going, as David couldn't go. However, it was pointless arguing with my parents, so I bit my lip and told myself that I'd just push through it. Anyway, the night of the so-called sleepover came around with about 50 campers alongside 15 plus counselors. We would all be sleeping in the school's gym, which wasn't too bad of an idea. It was huge and was the safest place in the school, with it being a hurricane shelter. Our camp counselors told us it was lights out and to get into our sleeping bags. So fast forward till a few hours later, I was in my sleeping bag with my blanket I had brought when I for some reason wake up. I wasn't really sure why I woke up, but it happened so suddenly and so randomly. Everyone throughout the gym was fast asleep, so I decided to use this time to go get a drink of water from the fountain. Anyway, I'm half asleep and slowly get out of my sleeping bag and walk out of the gym to where the hallway was. As I'm getting a drink of water, I look to my left and see a man I had never seen before lurking by the vending machines. However, he didn't appear to be a counselor or any staff member, as he didn't have on a uniform. He appeared to be a dad. Middle-aged, glasses, a flannel shirt, just a casual guy. For whatever reason, he seemed to be acting cautious, as if he were trying to avoid being seen. I was a little freaked out, but I wasn't scared, as it's always never been easy to scare me. He of course spots me, and he immediately puts his finger over his lips like a cartoon character, making a hushing sound. His face looked stoned and his eyes were wild as he approached me, asking where the nearest exit was. When I asked who he was, he hesitated for a moment before saying he was the camp director. Of course, being only 9 at the time, this relieved any worries I had, as I believed him. He kneeled down to my height, patted me on the back, and left through the doors. I then see him walk around everyone's backpacks and go through them for a couple of minutes before finally leaving. That being said, I was still scared and remember going back to my sleeping bag. The next morning came around when I was awoke to many of the staff and campers in a panic. Some were talking about how their phones, wallets, and even clothes were stolen. When camp security got involved, I had to tell them about the man from last night. I remember my camp counselors scolding me, demanding to give them a description of what he looked like and to make sure I wasn't lying. But being only 9, the description I gave was anything but useful. The only piece of information I really gave was that he had glasses and wore black clothing. The police were called, which led to an investigation, but as far as I know, there have been no leads to the man. There were cameras in the gym too, but the quality was ultimately too low to identify who he was. Long story short, my mom never let me sleep over anywhere until I turned 13. She pulled me out of that summer camp and put me into a new one that wasn't the best, but far better than the other one. That night will never leave me as I became a little more wise as to what actually happened. Because of the paranoia, I always keep my doors and windows locked in my house. Some might call me crazy for worrying about something that happened a while ago, but I see it as a precaution. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can learn from it. This happened back in 2006 at a sleepaway camp in rural Georgia. I was around 13 years old, and it was the midsummer, meaning no school for a whole 3 months. I'd always go to sleepaway camp every summer, and it was a pretty good experience if you wanted to get out more. It was a 5-week trip, and for the first 2 weeks, things went pretty well with tons of activities us young teens would be into. One night, one of our head counselors had told us that we'd be doing an optional early morning activity. It was an annual ritual the campers did called the Polar Bear Ice Challenge. Basically, how it worked was one of the counselors would throw in a watermelon at the bottom of a lake, and the first person to find and grab it won a prize. However, the only hazard was that the water was extremely cold, even during the summer. It was a meaningless activity, but we enjoyed doing it. The next morning at around 6 a.m., the campers who had volunteered woke up and 2 of our counselors led us to the lake. The counselors lined us up on the dock and explained the rules. No teaming, no horseplaying, no fighting, etc. That being said, he grabbed the watermelon, threw it into the lake, and blew the whistle. We all dive in and were met with the extreme coldness that almost caused us to get out. I tried diving back into the water to try and feel for the melon when something grabs my foot and starts pulling. Figuring it was another camper, I tried resisting to make him let go. It was then when I realized that whatever was pulling me didn't feel like a hand. It felt so abnormal, I couldn't see what it was. After what seemed like forever, I managed to go to the surface where I could see all of the scouts on the bank looking at me. One of the counselors immediately realizes as to what's happening and dives in and manages to make whatever was drowning me let go. He pulls me to shore and everyone is questioning me, but all I could tell them was that something had pulled me. The 2 counselors look at me, and my ankle is bright red. We go back to camp where my parents and a health assistant were called. The staff at the camp had dismissed the redness as a rash, but none of us bought it. I haven't been back to that site since, and I'm not sure if I ever will. I still don't know what it was that grabbed me, but I sure as hell don't want to find out. It wasn't until a couple of years later where I had brought it up over dinner with my family. My mom and dad looked at me wide-eyed and told me something I didn't know. As it turns out, there was someone who had lived nearby and went into the lake trying to mess with people. He did this by using a metal wire, which is why my ankle was red. That whole campground closed down because of it and was unable to reopen until the investigation was over. She says I should be very grateful we weren't in that water for too long, as it could have been a whole lot worse. That was the scariest thing that's ever occurred in my life.